Good afternoon, HASP scholars here in the HASP classroom and out in Zoom land. My name is Tom Glover. I'm serving as a coordinator of the HASP class called Understanding the Core of the Israel-Palestinian Conflict, presented by John Kleinhexel. Mr. Kleinhexel is a retired pastor who has served both RCA churches and the Presbyterian Church USA. His call to the Christian ministry has taken him to pastorates in 4 different states. He holds a BA from Hope College, majoring in English and philosophy. He received his theological training at New Brunswick Theological Seminary in New Jersey and at Western Theological here in Holland. He retired from full-time ministry in 2003. And since that time, he's stayed pretty busy though. He served as a wedding coordinator for the American Church in Paris, France for 6 months, and for 5 months as an associate pastor for education at a United Church of Christ in Tokyo, Japan. So that's his retirement so far. The thrust of his retirement activities really involved his lifelong interest in problems in the Middle East. His interest in the subject really took off in 1975 while he and 8 other RCA clergymen were on a tour of several Middle Eastern countries. It was on this trip that a bus taking them to the Beirut airport was accosted by armed youth. This experience led him to become involved in Kairos, which is a global network of people who are pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian, and pro-peace. He has visited Israel-Palestinian area 3 times, and in 2017, he helped found the West Michigan chapter of the Global Kairos Network. He'll talk more about the Kairos Network during his presentation. As you are aware, Mr. Kleinhexel's presentation is in 3 parts. Previous sessions of this class covered understanding the Jewish and Arab identities. Then in section 2, there was the explanation of the Christian Zionist perspective and its implications on United States policy. And today, the final presentation will be, where do we go from here? Please welcome Reverend John Kleinhexel again to the past classroom and the screens of the Zoom audience.
Thank you, Tom.
So you've got
Yeah, I got it. Hello, friends. Glad to have you in virtual land and you in the classroom. We have a lot better attendance today than last week when we had such a snowstorm. So we're in good shape for carrying on with our 3rd and final really immersion into Israel-Palestine. Thanks for hanging in there with us and for being open to what is brought to your attention today. As you may know, just as we have in this country issues with people of color and African-American people, this is the prism through which we ought to look at Israel-Palestine. It is not going to be solved. Equality and mutual respect is not going to be solved overnight. It is a process. It's going to take generation after generation. There will be times when it goes backwards. There will be times when it goes forward. And we in the grassroots are wanting to have it, wanting to be part of those who are as the Arabic word has it, samud, patience, persistence, nonviolence, and moving the needle forward. So we're going to tackle a really tough subject, and I want to be hopeful. It's easy to be despairing and to say, oh, let them fight it out. It's none of our business, which is not a good stance to take because we are deeply, as a country, maybe not so much as the church you're a part of, but as a country, we are deeply committed to the viability of the Israeli state. Not so much the Palestinians. We want them to merge in with Israelis according to Israeli preferences. And this is what is impinging upon the rights of people who've been in the land for a long, long time. So I want to give us a little overview and a sense of direction. As you may know from the first 2 sessions, I try to be balanced and even-handed but I am very much committed to wanting Americans in Western Michigan and within the reach of my voice to understand the Palestinian point of view, which is not understood by the broad stream of the United States. I'm also wanting to introduce to you, and he's going to wave his hand, my partner in crime, Bart Denboer, right in the back corner there. Bart is the executive director of our chapter of the Kairos movement, Kairos, West Michigan. And I've asked him near the end to spend a little time with you in explaining what we're going to do October 26th to November 4 in taking a tour of the sites with Palestinians and with Israelis. It's going to be evenly balanced, and we invite you to be part of it, be thinking about it as we go on. Now, one of the groups that we are not directly affiliated with, but we have a great sympathy with, is a youthful Jewish-based advocacy and action group in the United States. It's called JVP for short, Jewish Voice or Voices, because there are many, for Peace, JVP. And its goal, along with the goal of Kairos, is to break open the Zionist ideal, which is an exclusively Jewish state. Ooh, how can any state in this whole globe be only one ethnicity? How can a state today only be one ethnicity? Think about it. Is that realistic? We don't think so, and neither do hundreds and perhaps thousands of youthful Jews in the United States. So their goal, JVP, is to open the Zionist ideal to include other ethnicities: Yemen, Ethiopian, Palestinian, people who are there as second-class citizens of the state, of the Israeli state, and also in the West Bank and Gaza, to treat them as full citizens, equal to Jews, celebrating our common humanity. Now, here's a 6.5-minute video that gives the JVP overview of the history of our region and their suggested way forward. Please give a listen.
What would happen if you built a refuge for a persecuted people in a place where another people already lived? In the next few minutes, you'll learn why this moral quandary is at the root of the struggle between Israelis and Palestinians, and what you can do to help achieve a just peace for everyone in the region. First, there are a couple of things it's helpful to understand. One, many Jews fled harsh persecution in anti-Semitic Europe, especially the Nazi Holocaust. Zionists encouraged massive immigration to historic Palestine, at that time a British colony, where Jews had an age-old connection and where small Jewish communities had long existed among larger groups of indigenous peoples. But when the UN offered the Jewish immigrants the majority of the land for a new state called Israel, for the indigenous Palestinians who lived there, it was a massive destruction of life. They rejected the UN's partition plan, and several Arab states invaded the new state of Israel. Israeli forces essentially erased over 400 Palestinian villages and towns. By the end of the fighting, Israel controlled 78% of historic Palestine. And when 750,000 Palestinians who fled or were expelled during fighting tried to return to their homes where the new state now stood, they were permanently barred by the Israeli government. While over 100,000 of their relatives and neighbors who hadn't left became second-class citizens of the new state, along with the new Jewish majority. Today, Palestinian refugees and their descendants number in the millions. Most are in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and Jordan. Many are spread throughout the world, with millions still living in refugee camps, seeking to return to their homeland. To sum up, one group of refugees found a much-needed home, but in the process, a new group of refugees was created. Here Here's the second thing to understand. Israel was founded as a Jewish state. But now ask yourself, what exactly does that mean? People had lots of ideas about what a Jewish state should look like. Some called for equality for all citizens. But what was created, in practice, was institutional discrimination against non-Jews. In other words, Israel ended up being built on a blueprint of exclusion. The Israeli government wants maximum land and resources for Jews, but not the Palestinians living there. That's why, inside Israel, Jews get special privileges, including rights to land and housing, that are denied to the Palestinian citizens, who make up 20% of Israel's population. That's also part of why Israel has never defined its borders. In fact, they still hold on to land, the West Bank and Gaza, that they conquered in the war in 1967. Since then, Israel has built Jewish settlements throughout the occupied West Bank, building Jewish-only cities and supplying them with infrastructure like roads and army camps, schools, and even a college. Military occupations are meant to be temporary, but after 40-plus years, this one looks permanent and entirely unjust. In the West Bank, Israeli Jewish settlers and Palestinians live on the same land, but must live under two completely separate and unequal systems of Israeli law. The Jewish settlers dominate the natural resources, including water and agricultural land, and they're backed by the Israeli army. To maintain the occupation, Israel has demolished thousands of Palestinian homes and orchards, confiscated Palestinian land, bombed a captive civilian population in Gaza, and punished resistance with raids, arrests, and assassinations, all to gain maximum land while making life so difficult for Palestinians that they will either leave or be too afraid to resist. Palestinians have fought back. For decades, they tried to achieve national liberation through armed struggle. Some groups still do. But the majority now support popular protest instead. The deeply harmful pattern of control, repression, and violence profoundly harms Palestinians living under occupation and Israelis living as occupiers. This must be broken to reach a peaceful and secure future for both peoples. Now that you understand the problem, what about the solution? What about peace talks? So far, over 2 decades of U.S.-backed peace talks have actually made things worse by helping Israel continue the occupation. It's been years of talking while Israel massively expanded the Jewish settlements and literally redrew the map. Peace talks are good if they're real, but not when they're theater to cover a land grab. So now what? The current world superpower, the United States, has been a terrible friend, enabling Israel's destructive and self-destructive expansion onto Palestinian land by funding the Israeli military, the biggest recipient of U.S. foreign aid in the world. But there's another superpower that can make the difference: you. There's a movement with hundreds of thousands of people just like you across the world, including Palestinians and Israelis, protesting, educating, divesting, and boycotting, all to bring nonviolent international pressure on Israel to stop violating human rights of Palestinians. Throughout history, where governments have failed to push for justice, people just like you, like us, have taken the lead and won. Now it's the Palestinians' turn for freedom and justice. We can pressure Israel to end the occupation and the discrimination. We want all people, Jews and Palestinians, to have equality, human rights, and democracy. We can change history. Join us.
I guess I've maybe messed things up a little bit here. Sue, you'll have to get me back on track. I wanted to get out of that. Okay.
It's just tricky. Goodness gracious, it's tricky.
There we are. I was going to get rid of this banner, but
Yeah, so when you start progressing your slides,
Yeah.
It's going to automatically disappear.
Okay. All
Sorry
right.
about that.
Sorry. Well, thank you for your help. Okay, so you've got a little overview, and the rest of the class session really unpacks this thing about equality and steps that are being taken today toward equality for all of the residents of that whole area. So there we go. I want to quickly go through, this is not uncommon that ethnicities have two impulses. There's the origin stories that denote them as special. And they swing back and forth between the tribal instinct and the universal instinct. We have to think about others who are different than we are. And so the Judeo-Christian origin story is that human beings were created first, not the state of Israel, not the American state, not Babylon, not Persia. Abraham was there. He chooses Abraham, which is a very tribal and it's very specific and personal thing, but in order to be a blessing to all the nations. That's the universal. And of course, that plays out in different ways. I understand that. So the identity of the Jewish nation goes back to memories of the Exodus from Egypt and the return from Babylonian exile. There is in each one of us a yearning for home. For hundreds of years, Israelis in their liturgy would say, next year in Jerusalem. There is a deep-seated desire on the part of Jews for a homeland when they were put in exile by the Romans in 70 AD. And so they've been dispersed to all the nations. They've thrived in other nations, but around late 1800s, with a lot more specific persecution of Jews as Jews, the notion really emerged in the nationalistic setting. Why don't we get our own country? Let's have our own country. And so you have this tremendous impulse. Genesis 1-11 is the story of chaos to creation and back to chaos. It was very good, and yet the earth now became filled with violence. And you had the empire come in as a solution to all of our problems. But what happens is that people get sucked in and they are made to merge with the empire, and their individual identity is torn out. So the goal is that there be room for other ethnicities in empire, in the nation state. Well, I love that new interpretation of the Tower of Babylon, the Tower of Babel, which came out of the struggle the Jews had with the Babylonian exile. So you always have this notion in each one of our hearts, in each nation, in each organization, there's us and there's them. We're inside, you're outside. And so part of the insiders say, well, we have to be concerned about those outside. What are we going to do about them? So, oh, no, we're not interested in them. So you have this back and forth that happens in organizations, congregations, neighborhoods. Not in my backyard, we say. So in Genesis 12, God begins again to bring a community out of the breakup of empire. Abram is not a Jew. He's not a Christian. He's not a Muslim. He's a worshiper of the one God, blessed to be a blessing to the nations of the world. Oftentimes, if we're around long enough, we want to merge our religion with our society. And that's going on in the United States. As all of you know, there's a tremendous impulse for us to be a Christian nation. And what's good for the nation is good for the church. What's good for the church is good for the nation. That's understandable. But if there's too close a merger, as is happening in the United States and in Israel today, there is something that goes wrong. We start thinking that we are the ultimate expression of the ideal God-blessed society, and God is going to bless us. God is going to bless us. And so to go against us is to go against the big guy. Oh, boy. And if you got the big guy on your side, you're really in for a battle. So when a lot of the Jews came back from Babylonian exile because of King Cyrus the Persian, who defeated the Babylonians, there was a tribalism in Israel. So you have the story of Jonah, probably written in the 3rd century before the Christian era, when Jews were now home and practicing Jewish centricity, including the other, excluding the other. Go to Nineveh, you're crazy. I'm not going to go to Nineveh. They hate us. They've done their best to destroy us. You care about a dying bush, but not about Nineveh? Shouldn't I be concerned about Nineveh? We think that scriptures are uniform and to be taken completely literally, and yet scriptures can be self-critical. They say of a certain aspect of being an Israeli, don't be ingrown, don't be only tribal. Consider and care about the other, even enemies. What kind of heterodoxy is that? So how is all this relevant to the United States in our relationship with Israel and Palestinians? One impulse is to subsume or subjugate Native Americans, Afro-Americans, Asians, and other minorities under male white supremacy. Or subsume Palestinian Arabs, Christians, and Muslims to permanently disenfranchised minority status in the Jewish state. Under Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump, I might add, Israel became even more Jew-centric than ever, marginalizing Palestinian Arabs and African Jews of color. As seen by the basic law passed by the Knesset in 2018 during the Trump administration, clearly privileging Jews over Arabs. I probably should have that reminder again of that law, if you remember it from 2 weeks ago. In keeping with the Zionist goal, I'm going to pass up, because we've got a lot to cover. I'm going to pass up the archival expose of how the Zionist goal was to eliminate, get rid of the indigenous population. Okay, now I'm going to move to trends and anecdotal examples, both personal changes that are happening and some of the systemic, meaning institutionalized, indicators of the resolution that all of us are seeking. And by the way, a majority of Jews, when polled, and a majority of Palestinians, when polled, in the West Bank as well as in the country, want a resolution. They want a resolution of this issue. But the leadership, Israeli leadership and the Palestinian leadership, are afraid of giving up control. That's what they're afraid of. And so they allow the extremes of both sides to play off against one another and say, you see, when you give in, you don't have anything. And it's because their hegemony, their control is being jeopardized. Last year, we had David Pelagi, thanks to Bart Denboer, who has met him and worshiped with him at the Christ Church in East Jerusalem. reminded us that this is an Israeli-Arab problem. And be careful, you Americans, like we're doing today, thinking that you can be a player in this. You get to go home. You get to go home after your tour. We have to stay here. We've got to work it out. So he gave us an example. A Muslim mom comes to a life-changing faith in Jesus. She tells her dad, who's a Muslim, he throws her out of the family. There is Norma at Christ Church, a believing Jew who heads the Mercy Fund, which helps this mom and introduces her to the Arab believing community in Christ Church. So there's an Arab believing community at Christ Church. And so she comes to know Camilla, an Arab social worker. They've engaged 2 lawyers to help her seek asylum so she won't be killed. And so David gave that as an example of problem solving over the long haul. So, I mean, this is happening in a very personal way. And we know systemically, I have these discussions with people. Well, that doesn't touch on the real systemic discrimination going on. Yeah, I understand that. But it's when people's minds and hearts get wrapped up in, oh, that shouldn't be happening to a family with a child being, when Israeli forces come in at 3 o'clock in the morning and everybody's sleeping in a Palestinian home, and they come in and they grab the 13-year-old and accuse him of throwing stones and bring him to a military detention center again and again and again. Something wrong about that. Don't you think so? Don't you think there's something wrong about that? Okay. Now, as we know, you may not know that there is a real gap between the religious settler Jews and the secular Jews. They get mad at each other often. The secular Jews say, you're ruining our reputation because you're insisting on this and this and this and this. And so they're cringing at the brazen extremism in the religious settlement community. So that's part of what's going on. The assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in 1995 was a real wake-up call. And this is a Rabbi Nave, really enlightened guy. He says it prompts us to both then and no less now do something to change that painful gap. For me personally, he said, in this Times of Israel, TOI, you'll see it often in my presentation. You'll see it often. For me personally, that moment of recognition came as I looked into my contacts and was shocked by its homogeneity. I'm only with people that look at that think the way I do. The broader recognition demands that we expand society's contacts. This is in dark print now. That we each make the effort to look beyond our initial circles and forge bonds with those who think, look, and act differently. Well, that's, of course, exactly what is needed in the United States of America society as well. We need to be willing to engage in conversation and in a real listening time with those who think differently than we do. Of course, the wall, it militates, that's running right through Israeli and Palestinian territory, militates against that kind of fraternization. And when the sign that you see, when you go, you see the sign, Israelis are not permitted. They're not permitted to go into Palestinian territory. It's too dangerous. Stay away. Keep them away. Keep them in this place. We be here in this place. That's the spirit that we're trying to break down. So, I suggest that if there's a gap between religious settler Jews and secular Jews, imagine the gap between Jews and Arabs. It compounds the division. Now, the kibbutz movement was a wonderful thing in many ways. Socialist, oh, we don't want to have to do anything with socialists, but a lot of them came from Russia. So that was their background from 1917 on. So you have a guy named Yaniv Saji. Read his story. I could take you to the Plough Quarterly. It's a Bruderhof quarterly journal. Anabaptist background. We believe that the Jewish people need a homeland. Okay, we're coming back to Zion. It's historical, natural. But we also believe in the kibbutzim movement. It's possible to live together with Palestinian people that have been living in this space for so long. That's what I learned from my dad. For 54 years, Israel has been an occupier in the West Bank. These are his words now. People there and in Gaza are living in cruel conditions. Oh, it's because of Hamas. Oh, okay. Bloody terrorist group, but that doesn't change that fact. Israel describes itself as a democratic Zionist Jewish state. We need to decide between the Jewish and democratic nature of the state. Israel must continue to be a homeland of the Jewish people, but also a shared state where all citizens are equal. Ooh, how dare you talk about equality? So then he goes back to the politically correct notion that both Palestinians and Israelis have to have their own state with 67 borders. So many of us were so encouraged when in April 3 of last year, that's less than a year ago, Blinken called in person on Israel to ensure equal treatment of the Palestinians as the new administration stepped up its efforts for a two-state solution. Oh, I guess I want to take you there. This is from the Times of Israel now, which is an Israeli paper. Ooh, wow. Our Secretary of State said to the Foreign Minister, Ashkenazi, there he is. Equal treatment of the Palestinians. Equal measures of freedom, security, prosperity, and democracy. But he couched that also by saying, we are committed to Israel's security, and quote, the strengthening of all aspects of US-Israel partnership. Support for the Jewish state's agreements over the past year to normalize relations with 4 more Arab nations. This is the so-called Abraham Accords, and I'll be saying a lot more about that in a little bit later in this presentation. The United Arab Emirates, UAE, Morocco, Bahrain, and one that escapes my memory right now. Okay, there are now, the rest of the time I want to spend time on 3 very serious proposals. You have them in front of you from a previous thing that I wrote up. There is the two-state solution. It was originated in 1947 by the United Nations. The fairest, although it doesn't make either ethnicity happy, The fairest is to have an Israeli state and a Palestinian state, clear borders, recognition of each other in safety and security. And that is today still the official position of the United States and the international community and the Palestinian Authority and Israel itself. A second claimant or a serious proposal is the so-called one democratic state. It was initiated in 2007, and Jeff Helper, one of our friends who was raised in the United States, is now operating from Israel, is wanting to bring it to bear. We'll look at it more carefully. And there is now a third model, which is the so-called confederation model, typified by Bishara Baba, and a similar proposal by a Jew, Bernard Avishai, and a Palestinian American Arab businessman named Sam Bahur. I'm going to take you to that in a moment. Again, the Times of Israel has got us on this. Confederation can resolve the conflict. Two sovereign states, each agreeing to give up some of its powers to a joint commission or authority to advance the well-being of their citizenry. Okay, enough of that. We're going to look at these three schemes in detail, remembering that all three run deeply counter to the prevailing view in Israel that the status quo of Jewish supremacy is to be maintained at all costs. That's the present view. We are saying, the Kairos movement is saying, and the JVP people are saying, and so many in the know about what's going on say the two-state is doomed. It's doomed. What it has meant in practice is separating Israelis from Palestinians, seizing control of the occupied territory and East Jerusalem, and finding collaborators who will agree to Palestinian autonomy on as little non-contiguous land as possible, without compromising Israeli security. The two-state solution, as it's been practiced, condemns Palestinian citizens to permanent second-class status within their own homeland, in an ethnocentric state that denies their rights by enacting laws that privilege Jews constitutionally, legally, politically, socially, and culturally. So now we move to the second alternative. Basic alternative is the one democratic pluralistic state, as begun in as early as 2007, which is 12 years ago now, 14 years ago, 15 years ago. Mostly Arabs, and these are the principles. The historic land belongs to all who live in it. Any system of government that rules must be founded on the principle of equality in civil, political, social, and cultural rights for all citizens. There must be just redress for the devastating effects of decades of Zionist colonization in the pre- and post-state period. A second slide on this, a recognition of diverse character of the societies. This is kind of an opening to the confederation or the federation model, which is beginning to emerge more, I think. It's not going to, these changes are not going to happen all at once. There's going to be a slow evolution. If we can keep the extremists from having a violent effort to overthrow things, it will evolve that the separate character of the Palestinian culture and ethnicity will be more and more brought to bear. the creation of a non-sectarian state that does not privilege the rights of one ethnic or religious group. Of course, that has now been offset by that terrible basic law of 2018, which does enfranchise Jewish exceptionalism. Of course, they want the right of return, the creation of a transparent and non-discriminatory immigration policy. Okay, the recognition, this includes the recognition of the historic connections between the diverse communities inside the new democratic state and their respective fellow communities outside. In articulating the specific contours of such a solution, those who have been historically excluded must play a central role. Bring them into the process. And finally, on the one democratic state, the struggle for justice and liberation must be accompanied by a clear, compelling, and moral vision of the destination. A solution in which all people who share a belief in equality can see a future for themselves and others. We call for the widest possible discussion, research, and action to advance a unitary, democratic, which means diversity, allowing for diversity, democratic solution, and bring it to fruition. This is from Madrid and London in 2007. Whew, wow, it's been pretty heavy duty. How are you doing on this? Anybody have a comment that you want to make? Tom, you want, oh, you got a, where's Tom? Have you got the microphone? I'm eager for a little feedback from people. Why do you think the conflict has persisted so long? Why is it being adjudicated? Anyone want to make a comment about where you're at right now? We've been going pretty hot and heavy here, and I'm needing to have a little break. Marilyn's got a comment over here, Tom. No, okay.
I got it. I'm looking forward to this because it's pretty clear that the other two aren't. I mean, it just
Something is not working in the two-state
it
is not
just seems the
working.
one and the two state just aren't going to work. Just
Okay.
from everything I've seen in the past, they both have, there has to be new thinking because the old thinking isn't working at all.
So
At least-
there are no clear boundary lines
Yeah.
that are there. Nobody wants to set a boundary
Right.
to what the new state would be.
Right.
And Israelis are fearful of giving any empowerment to the natives, because if they empower them, if they acknowledge that they have some more right to involve themselves, they will take over.
Yeah.
That's their
Yeah.
great fear. Dave's got a comment over here. Tom.
Mike, or I'm just gonna say it.
Oh, I want you to have the microphone right over here. Somebody's telephone is ringing. Okay, Dave Brower has a comment. Dave, what do you say?
It has been referred to quite often that the Jewish state is operating under the same principles of apartheid. The ending of apartheid happened because the international community said, this is enough. And they applied a political and economic pressure on South Africa. That has not happened. There's been a lot of talk, a lot of promises, but there has not been the will or the ability of the international community, especially the United States, to apply the kind of pressure on Israel that would force it to change.
Yeah. I was just handed by one of our class members a recent editorial in the Wall Street Journal of February 1. The apartheid label of Israel means that Jewish state should not exist. In other words, if you call what's going on in Israel apartheid, you are really delegitimizing the legitimacy of the Israeli state. You are really saying, we don't want you to exist anymore, which is really a pretty extreme interpretation of the call by now Amnesty International, as well as Beit Salem and the Human Rights Watch. All three of them have now come out and said, it's no different than it was in South Africa. No different at all. In fact, Bishop Tutu said in many respects, it's worse in Israel-Palestine than it ever was in South Africa. Okay, so now Baba says we need a loose association between two sovereign states. So in other words, there is a sense in which there would be some recognition of Palestinian sovereignty. And see, that's something that Israel doesn't want to give. They're not in a position to give any even limited autonomy to Palestinians. It's too dangerous. The extremists in control of Israel now say to give them autonomy is to open the door to us being destroyed. That's the bottom line. That's why they can't do it. So the West Bank settlements remain without expansion, and settlers would receive residential rights and maintain Israeli citizenship. These are some of the ways that he envisions it. Settlements would remain, but not expanding. Settlements would receive residency rights in what is determined as Palestinian territory, or they would have maintained Israeli citizenship. Israelis in Palestine, what is designated as Palestine, and Palestinians in Israel would be subject to local rules and regulations. They could vote in local elections, and yet they could vote in national elections in the country of origin. See, this sounds so reasonable, friends. It sounds so reasonable. It's one of literally scores and scores of practical suggestions for resolving the issue. But it's hung up on this notion of, no, we can't give autonomy to the Palestinians. We just can't. They want to ruin us. They want to destroy us. They want to kick us out. They don't want to have us be here anywhere. So that's the thing. So Baba is saying freedom of movement for peoples, goods between porous borders, security cooperation between Israelis and Palestinians, some of which is happening today, a shared Jerusalem. Oh, no. It's the eternal undivided capital of the Israeli state. No, we can't share it with anybody. Full access to holy sites. Okay, this way, he says, each side wishes to preserve its national, political, and cultural distinctiveness. He says that's a good thing. That's good. Sides already share currency, electricity, infrastructure, and etc. So partition would be logically impossible. This comes back to what Marilyn said. There is no way now with the settlements in all of the West Bank, there's no way that you can separate those 750,000 people. Say, no, you can't be in this territory because this is going to be the Palestinian state. You can't dislodge 750,000 Israelis from the West Bank. There has to be some kind of unitary which allows for democracy. The only thing that's not said here is about water. Israelis control the water, I'll tell you that. Security planning could marginalize rejectionists from both sides, and that's one of the really huge issues. There would be a porous dotted line border that would enable cross-border investment and entrepreneurial partnerships. Some of that is happening now. We'll see that in a moment. There's a lot of partnerships that are happening. The barriers are the United States would have to hold Israel accountable to such a plan. There is no way that Congress, either the House or the Senate or the White House, would be allowed by the Israeli lobby to do that. We are an occupied country. Israel owns Congress. Israel owns the White House. Does that sound anti-Semitic? Does that sound like I hate Jews and want them out of the country? That's what they want people to believe, that if we criticize or put any pressure on them, we don't want them to exist. We don't want them to exist. That's the extremism of today. Why would Israel agree to a confederation model? They have vast security capabilities and significantly more power. Why give it up? Unless there's some pressure. Oh, I'd love to take you to this. I guess let's take just a look at it for a moment. 2 days ago, this came to my attention. Yossi Beilin, I think is how you pronounce it, was a former justice minister in the cabinet, was part of the Meretz party, which is the liberal party in Israel. And now he wants to say confederation is the way to go. Confederation is the way to go. Has a lot to commend it. Allow settlers to remain in their homes, as in the Baba plan. Easier to cooperate and coordinate if the framework is a confederation rather than a two-state. Makes a lot of sense. He was part of the author of the Oslo Accords, by the way, 1993. There's no negotiations going on right now. He wants to raise the issue of confederation. International debate on resolutions to the conflict. A European-style model to link two ethnic nationalist states, an Israeli and a Palestinian one. Each would maintain its individual statehood, but operate under an additional layer of infrastructure that would bind the two peoples together rather than seek to divide them. An option for settlers to remain in the West Bank as residents, not citizens, with final boundaries of a Palestinian state. This is all, friends, such old news. It's back in 2007. That's exactly what was proposed back in 2007. Okay, thank you for, that's 2 days. That's 2 days ago. I had Sue put in a revised model because I wanted to add it. Okay, quickly, we've been at, oh my goodness, we want to allow at least 25 minutes for discussion. I'm almost done. The case for liberal Zionism. Now you need to know there's a difference between liberal Zionism and the people who want to dismantle Zionism. Big difference. The liberal Zionists want to say, we want the Zionist state, we just want it to change so that it will be more open to Palestinians. That's the liberal Zionists. And a good spokesman for that is a rabbi in Hollywood, California. He says to some people who are dissidents, young Jews in his synagogue, don't give up on the Jewish state. Don't give up on the Jewish state. He says there are dozens of groups in Israel seeking to create a shared society between Israeli Palestinians and Israeli Jewish communities. Let's support Israelis while advocating on behalf of democracy and equal rights and dignity of Israelis, minorities. I would love to take you to that article so you could read it. And I'm not even going to take you to dueling views on the deals between Israel and the UAE, And Jordan now is roped in on it also. There's now an agreement that has been signed. Jordan is going to give the Israeli state solar energy that's been created by solar stuff. They've got a lot of solar stuff. They're going to give Jewish state energy from their solar stuff, and Israel is going to give to Jordan more water because Israel controls the water in the Jordan River. So what you have is there are some Palestinians who are okay with it, which goes along with accommodation with the Israeli state, and others are saying you're betraying things. You're betraying our efforts to have our own country. So I have dueling points of view, but I'm not going to take you there. There's another, yes, Tom.
But there are a couple of questions from.
There are some questions. Okay, Sue, do you have them?
I do. And if you're going to take a natural break in a minute, we can wait, but they came in a little while ago. I'm going to go to the second one and then I'll go back to the first. Someone asked, what role can people do at the grassroots level? Is there legislation? It says, is there legislation? How can we divest? Investigate at American Friends Service Committee lists companies that profit on occupation. So I think investigate is a entity, just for your edification. The Wall Street Journal article is really an editorial with talking points of the Israeli lobby or the voice of a foreign government. What are the small steps we can take? Can we pay a visit to our field office or a member of Congress?
Well, if I can back up, we are in very close touch with the American Friends Service Committee, AFSC. We support what they're doing. They're Quaker-based. They are nonviolent. They are wanting to see changes there. So they have a lot of practical steps that they're suggesting. In terms of practical steps that we can take, we need to keep leaning on Representative Huizinga, who is not open to the Palestinian narrative. He is only listening to the Jewish lobby, that we have to in an unqualified way, support the Israeli state. And so we can keep writing letters to Huizinga and say, there's another point of view that you need to take into account. I don't know if I'm catching the drift of those comments or not. You have another question there, Sue?
Someone asks, I watch CNN and see Dana Bash on the news. I consider Dana a white woman of the Jewish faith. Is that what she is, or is her race Jewish? Likewise, there is a large population of Jews in Ethiopia. As far as the racial question, is their race Black or is their race Jewish? And it's related to the Whoopi Goldberg issue and just trying to understand if Judaism is a race.
I appreciate her point of view. I mean, the implication is that she has a statement. I am not hearing well enough to answer that comment, to address that comment. I'm sorry. I want to go on to say that there is a book, again, with the liberal Zionist point of view. Ethan Micheli has written a book, and it is a fantastic book. Israel for thousands of years was a place where everybody lived together, Jews, Muslims, Arabs, Europeans, and many others. It has to be a shared space, both physically and intellectually. And his point is that coexistence is not just a possibility, it's a current reality. He says there are Haredim, which is the ultra-Orthodox, and secular Jews are all integral parts of Israel. They are very much already work and live together and depend on each other even when they don't know it. And his point is there's bitterness and conflict, but with all of the vitriol and all of the hyperbole, the exaggeration, there is a very strong impulse for people to live together. this is, friends, this is absolutely true. I am so pleased with being involved with the Christian Science Monitor. It's a wonderful, they reviewed this book by Ethan Micheli. On the other side of the spectrum, and we in Kairos tend to be on this side of the spectrum. The Zionist ideal, the assumption by the anti-Zionist is that the ideal of a homeland exclusively for Jews is fatally flawed and must be dismantled. State of Israel has failed to live up to the ideal stated in her Declaration of Independence in May 1448. And here I've got it. I wanted it before. Here it is. Get this. The state of Israel, this is like our Declaration of Independence, which Black Americans are coming back to and say, we have to live up to what we said we were about. The state of Israel will be open to the immigration of Jews from all countries of their dispersion, will promote the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. The Jewish state will be based on the precepts of liberty, justice, and peace taught by the Hebrew prophets. Wow. That's what we're calling them to live up to, their best Jewishness. I would take you to Synagogue Tzedek, where they are leaving their non-Zionist moniker behind and are saying, we are now anti-Zionist. I'm going to go on past Jeff Helper here. Betty McCollum has a House resolution that we're trying to get House of Representatives to sign on to. We have often enlisted the support of Brad Parker and Shayna Lowe here in West Michigan. She was here when we opened up during COVID. We had a wonderful time at the Commons in Western Seminary. And there was just a handful of folks. It was our first effort to get back in person. And there were probably 12, 13 people there, a couple from Grand Rapids, a couple from Kalamazoo. Tough going. The Declaration of Independence. We will uphold the full social and political equality of all its citizens without distinction of race, creed, or sex. Will guarantee full freedom of conscience, worship, education, and culture. Will safeguard the sanctity and inviolability of the shrines and holy places of all religions. and will dedicate ourselves to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. This is when they were wanting to apply for recognition by the international community and get the imprimatur, the approval, the legitimacy from the United Nations, the international community as it's now called. So they call upon Arab inhabitants to return to the ways of peace. Don't fight us in our efforts to have our own homeland without you being full citizens. Don't fight us, please, because we are promising full and equal citizenship and due representation in our bodies and institutions. So what they are saying to the 20% of the Palestinian citizens in the state of Israel today is, and they say to the world, you see, we are a democracy. We do have Arabs in the Knesset. We have Arabs citizens. 20% of the citizenry are Palestinians. Imagine. So that's what they're clinging to as being a democratic state. But it is for, it privileges the Jews. That's the point. So there are 7 liberal-leaning United States Jewish organizations today, imagine, released an open letter calling on Israel's top leaders to take unequivocal action to stop ongoing terrorism and political violence committed by Jewish Israeli extremists in the West Bank against Palestinians, against Israeli civilians and IDF soldiers. Wow. Imagine that. That's hopeful, friends. That's hopeful. And to show that it's happening, get a load of this. The Israeli military disciplines 3 officers, get 3 weeks free, 4 weeks free. How can I get out of that? There we go. An 80-year-old Palestinian American. Now this gets the attention of Americans. He was an American. He was Palestinian, but he happened to be an American. He was detained by Israeli soldiers in the West Bank. Wow. The IDF said moral failure and poor decision-making. So because of that, friends, we cannot give up our hope that things can change. I want to give a little, this is the second of the last screen. And we're going to get to Bart right now. This is the last summary and review screen. I am urging us, 32 religions all have as the basis of their creed love for who they say is the prime mover and love for neighbor. All 32 of the major religious movements in the history of humankind say love your neighbor. So you have these movements right now. You have the one state, which is the status quo right now. Arabs are disenfranchised and they have our support, and Israel has our support. There's the 2-state solution, the official policy of the United States and Israel and the international community. Israel pays it lip service, but in principle, present Israeli leadership completely opposes it. They have never entertained the possibility of a Palestinian state. Never. So the other is one pluralistic democratic state, either by the Confederation model or the Jeff Helper model. And I quote Exodus 12:49 and Leviticus 7, verse 7. There shall be one law for citizen and alien. It's Judaism. It's in the Pentateuch. It's in the Pentateuch. Not 2 laws. Not a law for Palestinians, which is military-based, less safeguards, and one for the citizens, the Jews. 2 tiers. We call it apartheid. Okay, now I'm opening up for discussion. We have 22 minutes, and I do want to get you involved in this. I have told you why I think that it's not being resolved. Well, what do you think?
What role does the Jewish religious community play in influencing the leaders of Israel and so forth? And I'm wondering if a lot of that is based on some of the Old Testament writings about the primacy of the Jewish state and so forth.
Yeah. Now, this is true. If you look at the Old Testament, you will know that separatism is really built into the Israeli Jewish DNA. We can't mingle with the outsiders. We can't have deals with them. We are who we are, and that's not possible.
But on the other hand, you quoted some other Old Testament passages that seem to favor cooperation. So
yes, that's the other strand in the Old Testament.
Right.
The Hebrew prophets are so critical of the monarchy, of what's happened when David and later his son Solomon created this great nation. And the prophets came along and said, you think you're so great, but look what's happening to the marginalized, the poor, the widows, the orphans. Don't neglect them. And that's what was happening. So you have those trends in Hebrew scriptures, and you have those trends in the New Testament scriptures as well.
Contradictory often.
Yes. Any other? Here's a lady has a comment or a question.
I wanted to comment on a editorial on our paper, Opinion, and it's a letter to the editor from Jerusalem to London to New York. Time to face truth of apartheid. And this is from the gentleman you mentioned, Bart Denboer.
There he is. He's the culprit. He's the guy right in that corner there. He's the guy who wrote it.
Kudos.
Yes, and he articulates our point of view
You want the
beautifully.
mic, Bart?
Beautifully. Bart, come on up here. You've been sitting in the back row too long. I got to get you up here. A good friend of mine named Mazin Kumsia was operating in the United States for a long time. And he, during the Oslo euphoria, there were a lot of Palestinians who were tempted to come back home. And he was one of them. And Sam Bahur, who I've befriended also, was raised in Youngstown, Ohio. He's now back trying to be a communications entrepreneur in Ramallah. And Mazin sent me something the other day, and here it is. Oops, you took us off from the,
I did.
took us off from the
We
screen.
were having a little problem, but be mindful that camera.
Let's
is-
pull it,
No,
pull it.
no, it's okay. You're moving around a little bit, so be mindful that that camera is the one that's capturing both of
Yeah,
you. I will bring that back
you
up.
bring it back up because I have a screen that is dedicated to Bart and what's going on in Kairos.
Right. Well, give me a second. You guys chat away and I will get this started.
Yes,
again.
we're chatting away with everybody here and outside. Sorry about that.
No, this is. just-
Bart, while we're waiting for that screen to come up, you have been in Israel-Palestine many times with groups. And now you are going to take a group that is sponsored by Kairos, West Michigan. You're affiliated with that group now. And we're wanting to hear more about it. I know of one couple that's here already that has expressed an interest in wanting to go with us. And we want many more couples, singles, young, old, to come back to the Holy Land and see for themselves the strength of the Israeli position and the strength of the Palestinian position. So
We're almost there.
almost there, she says.
Oh,
All the way to the bottom. Modern technology.
Yeah, it's a lot right now.
Oh dear, now we're back to,
Yeah,
ah,
I know.
oh dear.
It's almost there.
Go to the end.
Good thing there's no pressure. Okay.
Oh, you're gonna go all the way through that way?
No, I'm
No.
gonna do this. Okay, you.
There we go.
tell
Yes,
me
I can
which
find
one
it. Yes, yes. Keep going. Okay. Okay, we,
Okay, well,
yeah.
now we'll. Oh, please share from the right one. Okay, I'm gonna press this button and we're gonna hope it goes to this slide.
Yes, all right, good. Well, what Mazin has said, and I am so encouraged by this, friends, so encouraged by this. Love is especially potent. Last week, this is last week, maybe Thursday or Friday, it's 5 days ago. A person who was hateful of Palestinians, this is a Jew now, because he was committed to Zionism, finally shifted to recognize our common humanity. I've been exchanging emails with him for years. If such a person raised from childhood on notions of Israeli exceptionalism can become friends, there is hope. He joins a long list of people I'm proud to count among my friends, so many who have shed Zionism, white supremacy, selfishness, greed, addictive, and other self-destructive habits. I love all as I love you all. A personal January 31, 10 days ago. So now if I can get going here. Come on. All right. So what I'm wanting to say, Bart, come here, watch this. We think, the Kairos, West Michigan people think that one of the best ways forward is for you, yes, you, to go with us on a trip. See in person what we're talking about. And I am very proud to say that Bart Den Boer is a semi-retired educator, Christian Reformed background. He has been a principal of schools and has been a top administrator in several schools. He helped set up the Bethlehem Evangelical Academy in Bethlehem. And as a good friend of Jeff and Gada, a Palestinian wife of Jeff Pribble, we're going to see them on our trip there. And I am so pleased to introduce Bart to you. He is the executive director of our movement. Do you have a place for them to sign up to be on our distribution list? Please put your name and address, email address. We will not besiege you with post after post after post, but we want you to be part of, we're just a little cog in a grassroots movement that is working with hundreds of people, thousands of people, to bring about a change over the next generations, youthful generations that are going to be beyond us. And so I want to bring out our website. Here is the website that tells you the story. When you go to kairoswestmichigan.org, all one word, kairoswestmichigan.org, you will get all the details on this trip. And so when you're speaking, Bart, please start saying something. I'm gonna bring them to the itinerary too.
I was waiting for John to stop talking. So
Never.
Okay, yeah, my heart is full. I've lived in Bethlehem and Jerusalem for about 2 years. And I'd love to get into everything that we're talking about today, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to say, reiterate what John said, that we've noticed personally and as an organization that once you go and you experience the people, to sit with parents, Palestinians and Israelis together in the same room, that both sides have lost kids, and to see them in the same room talking to each other, to see Arab, Palestinian Christians and Jewish Christians together listening to each other's stories and getting so angry at the fact that their way of seeing the world is so different from somebody else's way of seeing the world, and they're both Christians, and they get to the point where they can understand each other a bit. And so the beauty of actually going there and walking with these people is what will turn people into advocates and get us past the information and the education into the action. So that's why we think it's so important for people to go and see. The Arab word is actually tashuf, which means come and see. Come and see. And I have, for those that are interested, I have some printed out flyers, et cetera. If you're interested in more, obviously you can go to kairoswestmichigan.org, kairoswestmichigan.org. The entire trip is available on there, and you can see anything else you want to know about it. Couple questions maybe from you if we want to address, if you have a question about the tour that you think everybody would be interested in. Otherwise, I'll be available in the back. So
Will we be staying in a Palestinian home as part of the trip?
our itinerary right now includes 2 nights with Palestinian host homes.
Will we be seeing some of the ancient sites for those who have never been to the Nativity, Church of the Nativity, maybe up in Nazareth, some of the ancient Christian sites?
We've carved out time on the tour to visit places that are, I will say, even better than the Nativity Church. I mean, the Nativity Church is great, but really, who wants to crawl down in the basement to something that does not look at anything at all like the place that Jesus was born? Why not go to a place that looks like where Jesus was born? That's my bias. But yeah, we'll stop by the church as well, and we will see some other. I will see some other very significant Christian sites. Obviously, Jerusalem. We're walking by them all the time.
I do have a question in the chat, came in a little bit ago. He says, I appreciate your point of view. However, as I see the white Christian nationalism operate in our own country and how it undermines our democracy, how will the Zionism force be challenged within a true Israeli democracy? It seems like a Herculean task.
I've just studied the South African apartheid movement, I'm taking a class called Peacemaking in the Palestinian Context. Struggled from 1950 to 1980 with real progress, not until 1990. Hopeless. Back then, people said it was hopeless. It got to the point where the majority in South Africa, again, supported by a colonial mindset, a very racist mindset from the past, from the West, including the United States. The boycott, divestment movement and sanction movement in the United States did not happen all at once. It took a long time to get there. It took to the mid-'80s to get to that point. So I have hope. The South African experience, where they developed a constitution that guaranteed the rights of all citizens, They call it the best constitution in the world. Yes, even better than ours. The best constitution in the world, guaranteeing rights for everybody. Not having a peace at the point of a gun, but having a shalom peace, a salam peace, where people's rights and wholeness and the way God intended people to live together is a basis for the agreement. It happened in South Africa under very similar historical conditions as what's happening in Israel and Palestine. Not the same, but very similar. And so I have hope, and maybe not during my lifetime, but maybe in my grandkids.
I guess in summary, my question would be, how far can reform go without the US Congress, as you mentioned, Congress and the White House getting on board with it? We've got an endemic problem in our government with the power of lobbyists. And when you look at the power, singling out, because it's our topic, singling out the the lobbyists that are having so much influence, can we somehow overcome with our grassroots efforts? Can we overcome that obstacle?
I think the implication of one of this last comment by Sue Timmer relating what the Christian nationalism is undercutting American democracy. That is a relevant comment to the situation in Israel right now. So in America, if you have Christian nationalists say, no, we can't make it so easy for African Americans and people of color to vote because there's been such corruption and such a violation of stuff. So then some of us more liberal people, progressives, as we like to call ourselves, say, oh, you're wanting to restrict the voting rights of African Americans and people of color. So we quickly jump to that conclusion. May not be true. There may be some things about the Georgia law, for example, that strengthen the integrity of the voting process, okay? So, but Christian nationalism merging our Christianity in the United States, as is happening in Israel between Judaism and the Israeli state, can be a deterrent to justice, can be a deterrent to true democracy. We want true democracy in the United States. We want true democracy, not just for Jews in the Israeli state, but for the Palestinian citizens in the 20%, and to somehow enfranchise the 2 million, 3 million people, 2 million in Gaza, and another 1 million, 2 or 3 in the West Bank. We want them included in the Israeli state in an equality that is not there now. It's not there. And the world knows it, and the United States doesn't know it. We have no idea that that's the reality. So here we are, Kairos, West Michigan, one of the voices that are trying to lift up the voice of the cries of our brothers and sisters in Palestine. We're lifting them up. And there is no one except for a few in Congress who are routinely vilified because they are so out of touch with the way it should be, unqualified support for the Israeli state. So when you start to lift up the possibility that there are legitimate grievances by the people of the land, no. So that's all we're saying, and we're coming to a conclusion, and I thank you very much for your attention. There's a question over there, a comment, please. One last one, and we'll close at 2:30.
I just wanted to comment on what Bart said about the apartheid in South Africa. It was the Constitution was changed, the wording was changed. But you had a couple slides up there that were the Declaration of Independence for Israel that also showed very straightforwardly that these rights were meant for all citizens, regardless of the ethnicity or religion or anything. So how is that? Why are they? I mean, it's very straightforward written in that Declaration of Independence. So how are they getting around it without having changed? Have they changed or updated that Declaration of Independence since
You want
1947?
to tackle that one? Brian, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, great question. Israel has no constitution. It's based on
Basic
a
laws.
common law interpretation of what's been decided before. And so as John pointed out, these were declarations made to the League of Nations at the time, United Nations at the time, that this is what we intend to be. They do not have a constitution that guarantees the rights of everybody. It was nice wording that, in their application for statehood, but it's not a constitution as we understand a constitution.
If I can make one last comment, no one thought that an Arab member of the Knesset would be allowed in the ruling coalition. Mansour Abbas is a Palestinian Arab, and he's helping to prop up the existing ruling party in the Knesset today. He's vilified by extremists in the Palestinian side. You can't do that. He's doing it. He's wanting to represent his constituency and get something better for them. So is this a terrible thing? I don't know if it's a terrible thing. I just know that it's happening. And it was never considered ever by any Israeli party. We will never deal with the Arabs and allow them to have that kind of control. Guess what? He's now a part of the ruling coalition. So you can't give up hope.
That's an upbeat ending,
All
John.
right, thank you. I want to have upbeat endings.
Yes. Well, thank you, John, so much, and Bart, for your insights and your thoughts. I think it's made a lot of us think a little differently.
Good.
At least be well exposed to a different way to look at
Good.
this thing. So
Good.
thank you, John and Bart, and good luck with your trip.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you all for being part of it.